Dawn broke over the Karakum Desert in the spring of 1221, and the world was about to witness something that should have been impossible. The air smelled of dust and dried leather, and something else, something animal, alive, and relentless. To the west, the walled cities of the Khwarezm Empire stretched like jewels threaded on the Amu Darya River, each one a fortress, each one stocked with grain, each one certain of its own survival. The Shah Muhammad II had read his military manuals. He understood warfare. He understood that armies moved on their stomachs, that the longer you could hold out behind stone walls, the more surely your enemy would starve, wither, and dissolve back into whatever wilderness had produced them. He was wrong. Catastrophically, permanently, civilization-endingly wrong. Out of the desert came a force that moved like a living storm. 150,000 riders spreading across the horizon like a dark tide, their silhouettes multiplying against the morning sun until the sky itself seemed to darken. No supply wagons, no grain carts, no lumbering columns of ox-drawn provisions stretching back to some distant base camp. Just horses and men. Horses and men, as far as the eye could reach, in every direction, emerging from terrain that the Shah had calculated no army could cross without dying of hunger and thirst. But these men were not hungry. They had not been hungry for 10 days, and they would not be hungry tomorrow. This is the story of the single greatest military advantage in the history of human warfare. Not a weapon, not a tactic, not a general of supernatural genius, but something so fundamental, so embedded in the biology and culture of a people, that no enemy in history ever fully understood it until it was far too late to matter. The Mongol army did not conquer the world despite having no food supply chain. They conquered the world because they had made that supply chain irrelevant. They had transformed themselves down to the last man and the last horse into a self-sustaining organism of war. A machine that fed itself as it moved, that grew stronger as it advanced, that turned the very land beneath its hooves into fuel for further conquest. Every other empire in history, Rome, Persia, China, Byzantium, was ultimately a slave to the granary. Cut the supply line, and the army died. The fortress, and wait. It was the oldest strategic principle in existence. But the Mongols had not merely solved the logistics problem, they had eliminated it entirely. And in doing so, they had created something the world had never seen before and has never seen since. An army that was, for all practical purposes, unstoppable. Not because it could not be defeated on the battlefield, but because it could not be starved, could not be outlasted, could not be reduced by the patient arithmetic of hunger that had destroyed every other conqueror who ever marched too far from home. This battle, this centuries-long campaign of impossible logistics, changed the shape of civilization forever. To understand what the Mongols did, you first have to understand what everyone else was doing, and why it was killing them. Every great empire before the Mongols shared the same fatal dependency. The Roman legions, the finest military machine the ancient world had ever produced, required approximately 3,000 calories per man per day to function. Multiply that by the tens of thousands of soldiers in a standard campaign force, and you get a number that staggers the imagination. And then multiply it again by the weeks or months of a sustained campaign, and you begin to understand why the Roman logistics apparatus was, in many ways, more impressive than the Roman army itself. One supply wagon for every 10 soldiers. Grain depots positioned at precise intervals along every road. An entire bureaucratic civilization dedicated to the singular task of making sure that the men with swords had eaten recently enough to use them. Alexander the Great, whose campaigns remain the gold standard of ancient military ambition, spent months preparing the logistical ground before every major advance. He calculated grain requirements to the bushel. He positioned supply depots with mathematical precision. He could not move his army faster than his supplies could follow. For all his tactical genius, for all the legendary speed of his Macedonian infantry, Alexander was ultimately a man on a leash, and the leash was made of wheat. Napoleon Bonaparte, 2,000 years after Alexander, faced the same problem and found no better answer. His Grande Armée of 1812 marched into Russia with enough supplies for a short, decisive campaign. But Russia would not cooperate. The supply lines stretched, the wagons broke down in the mud, the grain rotted, and 600,000 of the finest soldiers in European history began to die, not from Russian bullets, but from the oldest enemy of armies, an empty stomach. Napoleon was not defeated by Russian generals. He was defeated by the distance between his granaries and his men. This was the universal condition of warfare. This was the iron law that every commander, in every era, in every civilization, accepted as simply and absolutely true as gravity. The Mongols had never heard of this law, or rather, they had grown up in a world where it did not apply to them. Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, was born sometime around 1162 on the banks of the Onon River, in a world without fixed borders, without cities, without granaries, without the concept of a harvest season as the foundation of survival. He grew up in a world where you ate what moved and what lived, and what you could find before the temperature dropped below zero, where the difference between life and death was measured not in strategic reserves, but in the health of your horses and the sharpness of your hunting instincts. He was not educated in logistics. He was educated in survival, which is a different thing entirely and a vastly more useful one. When Temujin looked at his horses, the small, shaggy, seemingly unremarkable horses of the Mongolian steppe, he did not see a vehicle for war. Every other commander in history saw horses as a means of transportation, a platform for cavalry charges, a way to move men faster than they could walk. Useful, important, but ultimately just a machine that needed to be fueled. Temujin saw something else entirely. He saw a walking granary. The insight was not strategic in the abstract sense. It was biological, practical, built from a lifetime of watching nomadic families survive the unsurvivable. A Mongolian mare produces roughly 2.5 liters of milk per day. A warrior with 5 mares, the minimum standard for a Mongol fighting man, had access to over 12 liters of high-protein, high-fat nutrition every single day, carried on the hoof, requiring no wagon, no road, no depot, no bureaucrat to manage its distribution. The milk could be drunk fresh. It could be fermented into airag, the mildly alcoholic, intensely nourishing drink that Mongol warriors consumed in quantities that astonished every foreign observer who witnessed it. It could be dried and processed into kurut, hard pellets of concentrated dairy protein that could survive months in a leather pouch without spoiling. And when the horse was no longer useful as a source of milk and transportation, when it was old or injured or simply surplus to the campaign's immediate needs, it became meat. Its blood, a hydration source in extremis. Its organs, the most calorie-dense part of the animal, consumed immediately, wasting nothing. The horse was not a tool of war that required feeding. The horse was food that also happened to carry a warrior into battle. This was the secret. This was the thing that no Persian satrap, no Chinese emperor, no Abbasid caliph, no European king ever fully grasped until it was far too late. They looked at the Mongol army and saw horsemen. They should have looked at the Mongol army and seen a moving food system with weapons attached. But the transformation of a nomadic survival strategy into a military doctrine of unprecedented power did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. It required a man who understood both dimensions, the ancient wisdom of the steppe and the strategic requirements of imperial conquest, and who possessed the organizational genius to systematize what had previously been merely instinctive. Genghis Khan was that man, and what he built was not merely an army, it was a new form of life, a superorganism of war that fed itself as it breathed, that sustained itself as it advanced, that treated the entire concept of a supply line as an enemy weakness to be exploited rather than a military necessity to be managed. The Persian chroniclers who recorded the Mongol arrival in their lands wrote with a terror that transcends mere military defeat. They were not frightened simply by the violence, which was spectacular and terrible. They were frightened by something more fundamental, by the sense that the forces descending on their cities operated according to rules that they did not understand and could not predict. Where were the supply wagons? Where were the grain depots? Where were the slow-moving columns of provisions that any competent commander should have been able to identify and target? They were nowhere. And that absence, that incomprehensible, impossible absence, was more frightening than any cavalry charge. You cannot defeat an enemy you cannot understand. And no one understood the Mongols. Not until it was far, far too late. The preparation for a Mongol campaign began not in a war council, but in a pasture, months or years before the first arrow was loosed. Everything started with horses. The Mongolian horse, Equus psavalski in the taxonomic literature, though the Mongols themselves had no use for Latin, was not an impressive animal by the standards of the civilizations it would help destroy. Standing barely 13 hands high, compact and shaggy, with a broad head and a stubborn temperament, it compared unfavorably in almost every aesthetic category to the tall war horses of the Persian cavalry, the bred stallions of the Chinese imperial stables, the massive destriers that carried European knights into battle encased in steel. A European knight, seeing a Mongolian horse for the first time, would have laughed. Some of them did. They stopped laughing fairly quickly. What the Mongolian horse lacked in height and elegance, it compensated for in a catalogue of virtues that, taken together, amounted to something close to a military miracle. It could survive on grass alone, not supplemented grain, not hay from a carefully managed storehouse, but the sparse, wind-blasted grass of the open steppe and the frozen ground of a Central Asian winter, by pawing through snow with its hooves to reach the vegetation beneath. It could carry a rider at a sustained pace of 90 to 120 kilometers per day, without the carefully spaced rest periods that other military horses required. It could go without water for longer than any European breed, and it produced, in the case of mares, a quantity of milk that was, for the Mongol warrior, not a bonus, but a primary food source. Each Mongol warrior rode with a string of horses, at minimum 5, often more, with elite cavalrymen maintaining strings of up to 16 animals. The numbers mattered in ways that went beyond the obvious tactical advantage of being able to switch mounts during a pursuit. They mattered because of what those horses produced simply by existing. 5 mares, producing collectively 12 to 13 litres of milk per day, gave a single warrior more protein and fat than a Roman legionary received from his official grain ration. And the warrior did not need to stop to receive this ration. He did not need to stand in a supply line, did not need to wait for a wagon, did not need to locate a depot. He reached across to the mare walking beside him and took what he needed directly from the source. But the horse was only the beginning. The full sophistication of the Mongol food system required understanding several distinct technologies, each one simple in isolation, each one revolutionary in application, all of them working together in a logistical ensemble that no other military force in history had ever achieved. The first technology was boards, and it deserves the title of the greatest military food innovation in human history. Boards was, in its essence, freeze-dried powdered meat. But that clinical description conceals a process of extraordinary precision and a final product of extraordinary utility. Mongol women who managed the entire domestic economy of the nomadic camp with a competence that their husbands' battlefield reputations have consistently overshadowed, would butcher cattle or horses in the late autumn when the animals were at peak weight. The meat was cut into long strips and hung on wooden frames in the open air, where the combination of freezing temperatures, low humidity, and the relentless wind of the Mongolian winter performed a desiccation that would take weeks in a heated drying room. The strips became hard as wood. Then they were taken down and ground, between stones, between the hands, by whatever method was available, into a fine powder that retained essentially all of the protein and fat of the original meat, while containing almost none of its water weight. This powder was then packed, tightly compressed, into the dried bladder or stomach of the same animal that had provided the meat. A single bladder, perhaps the size of a small backpack, could contain the processed equivalent of an entire cow. The arithmetic of this compression is stunning, even by modern standards. A warrior carrying a single bladder of borts on his saddle was carrying, in portable form, enough protein to feed himself and 3 companions for weeks, requiring only the addition of boiling water to reconstitute into a broth that would strike modern nutritional science as genuinely excellent field rations. Marco Polo, who travelled through the Mongol Empire in the 1270s and recorded what he saw with the methodical attention of a man who understood commerce and logistics, described the system with evident fascination. Warriors, he wrote, could travel for 10 days without stopping to cook a meal. They would take their daily portion of powdered meat, mix it with water in a small leather flask, hang the flask from their saddle, and allow the motion of the horse to agitate the mixture throughout the day into something between a thick drink and a thin porridge, consuming it without breaking stride. 10 days, no fire, no stop, no kitchen, no supply depot, just motion and protein and the steady consumption of distance. Alongside borts, the Mongol warrior carried kurut, dried cheese pellets that were, if anything, even more concentrated as a nutrition source. The process was simple but effective. Fresh milk was allowed to curdle. The curds were separated, shaped into small balls or irregular chunks, and then dried on the roof of the felt yurt in the sun and wind until they became hard enough to function, quite literally, as projectiles. A European knight who encountered kurut for the first time reportedly broke a tooth attempting to bite through one. The Mongols did not bite through them. They held a pellet in the cheek, allowing body heat and saliva to gradually soften it over the course of an hour, extracting a slow, steady trickle of fat and protein that sustained energy levels across the long hours between what a more sedentary culture would have called meals. Then there was Irag. Irag, kumis in the Turkic tradition, the two words referring to the same substance across the vast linguistic spectrum of the steppe, was fermented mare's milk. And calling it merely a drink is like calling a longbow merely a stick. It was, for the Mongol warrior on campaign, simultaneously hydration, nutrition, mild stimulant, and immune system support, delivered in a form that solved the one biological problem that technically afflicted many steppe peoples: lactose intolerance. The fermentation process that produced Irag broke down the lactose in mare's milk into lactic acid and small amounts of alcohol, typically between 1 and 3%, rendering it digestible by people who would have suffered badly from the equivalent volume of fresh dairy. The result was a liquid that provided calories, hydration, beneficial bacteria for gut health, and enough alcohol to take the edge off the fear before battle. All in a single leather pouch. The preparation of Irag on campaign was a logistical masterpiece of simplicity. A warrior would fill a leather bag with fresh mare's milk, add a small quantity of previously fermented Irag as a starter culture, and then hang the bag from his saddle. The warmth of the horse's body kept the fermentation process active. The constant motion of riding agitated the mixture. By the end of a day's hard riding, the bag contained perfectly fermented Irag, ready for consumption. The horse had, in the most literal possible sense, brewed the warrior's dinner while carrying him into battle. But even Borts, Kurut and Irag combined represent only the passive dimension of Mongol logistics, the food they carried. The active dimension, the food they acquired in motion, was equally sophisticated and equally essential. The Great Hunt, the Neg, was the institution through which Mongolian culture transformed the biological imperative of survival into the military discipline of empire. Twice a year, in spring and autumn, the entire Mongol nation mobilized for the Nerj, with a thoroughness and organizational complexity that would have impressed the most experienced European military planner. The hunt was not a sport, was not a recreation, was not a cultural ritual in the ceremonial sense. It was logistics, the production of preserved protein at industrial scale, and simultaneously the most rigorous military training exercise imaginable. The procedure was as follows. A commander, in peacetime a senior chief, under Genghis Khan, the Great Khan himself, would designate a territory, typically an area encompassing hundreds of square kilometers of steppe, mountain and forest. A line of riders would form at the boundary of this territory, stretching in some documented cases to over 130 kilometers from end to end, each man visible to the next, the entire line marked with flags and banners to maintain alignment. Then, at a signal, the line would begin to move inward. Slowly at first, maintaining perfect discipline, driving every animal in the designated territory: deer, wolves, rabbits, wild horses, wild cattle, birds, everything that moved, ahead of it, toward the center. The contraction of the circle took days, sometimes weeks. Animals pressed together in increasing density. Smaller prey were ignored. The discipline required was that nothing should escape the outer ring, that every animal in the original territory should be present in the final killing ground. When the circle had contracted to its minimum, the Great Khan entered first and killed. Then senior commanders, then warriors in order of rank. The killing was systematic, comprehensive and efficient. The waste was minimal. The yield was enormous. Under Genghis Khan, the Nerj acquired an additional dimension that transformed it from a food production exercise into a military readiness test of the highest order. Commanders who allowed animals to escape the ring through poor positioning, inadequate communication, or simple carelessness were punished with a severity that made the lesson unforgettable. The skills required to execute a perfect Nerj were, point by point, the skills required to execute a perfect encirclement on the battlefield. Coordination over vast distances, maintenance of a continuous line, communication across language and terrain barriers, discipline in the face of chaos and noise, and the pressing urgency of movement. The Mongol warrior, who had participated in 50 Nerge hunts, arrived on a battlefield with 50 repetitions of encirclement tactics burned into his muscle memory. He did not need to be told to close the ring. He had been closing rings since childhood. Beyond the Nerj, the campaign logistics included the Yam, the extraordinary relay station system that Genghis Khan established across his growing empire. Stations positioned at intervals of roughly 40 kilometers provided fresh horses, basic provisions, and communication support to imperial riders moving at the maximum sustainable pace. The Yam was not primarily a food supply system. It was a command and communication system. But it served a critical logistical function by ensuring that the central direction of a campaign was never constrained by the same physical limitations that bound the campaign's supply wagons. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in days. A supply order could be fulfilled and delivered before the army that required it had advanced far enough to need it. And then there was the final, darkest element of the Mongol food system, the one that every chronicler recorded with a mixture of disgust and reluctant admiration, the one that represented the absolute outer limit of what the system could provide when every other source had been exhausted. When a warrior's borts was gone, his kurut was gone, his airag was gone, and there was no gain to hunt and no farmland to plunder. The horse gave one final gift. A small incision to the jugular vein of the neck, carefully made, carefully managed. 200 to 300 milliliters of blood drawn directly into a leather cup, or simply drunk from the wound. Then the wound was compressed and bound. The horse walked rather than ridden for a period to allow recovery, and by the following day the animal was ready to give again. A horse could sustain this procedure repeatedly without serious harm if managed correctly. The blood was warm, high in protein and iron, immediately energizing. It was not done lightly, and it was not done in preference to any other option. But it was done. And the fact that it was available as a final option meant that the Mongol warrior had a level of last resort nutritional security that no other fighting man in history possessed. The night before a major campaign departure, in the felt yurt that was simultaneously home, office, and temple, a warrior performed his preparations with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his life and the lives of his companions depended on the quality of his attention. He checked his bort's pouch, pressing the leather, feeling for adequate density, confirming the seal against moisture. He counted his kurut pellets, distributed them evenly between 2 separate carrying pouches, so that losing one did not mean losing everything. He filled his airag bags from the communal batch, tasting each one to confirm the fermentation had reached the right stage. He checked his horses one by one, running his hands along their legs for any swelling, checking their hooves for stones, pressing his face against their necks and breathing in the smell of them. The particular warm, dusty smell that meant health and strength and another day of miles. He did not pray for victory. He was Mongolian. He prayed for the horses. The first great test of the Mongol food system was not recognized as a test at the time. It was recognized as an invasion, which it certainly was. But the strategic significance of what Genghis Khan proved in the campaigns against the Jin dynasty of northern China between 1211 and 1215 was not primarily about the battles fought or the cities taken. It was about what the Jin commanders expected to happen and what happened instead. The Jin dynasty had built its northern border defences on a calculation that was, by every historical precedent, entirely reasonable. The steppe nomads had always been a raiding threat, fast, violent, and difficult to catch in the open field. But they had never been a sustained imperial threat, for the simple reason that they could not sustain. A steppe raiding force could strike, loot, and withdraw. It could not besiege a walled city for months. It could not maintain a campaign through a Chinese winter. It could not feed itself far from its pastures. Eventually, every steppe raider went home, because home was where the food was. The Jin generals settled into their fortresses and waited for Genghis Khan to run out of provisions. He did not run out of provisions. He had not brought provisions in the conventional sense, and therefore he could not run out of them. His horses grazed on the grasslands of northern China, which were, in 1211, substantially more extensive than they are today. His warriors ate borts and kurut and airag. They hunted when the opportunity arose, adding fresh meat to their diet in quantities that would have seemed luxurious by steppe standards. And when they encountered villages and farmsteads that had not been emptied by their approach, they took what was there, not out of particular cruelty, but with the systematic practicality of a logistics operation. The countryside fed the army advanced. The Jin commanders, watching from their walls as weeks stretched into months and the Mongol forces showed no signs of the expected deterioration, faced an epistemic crisis that went beyond mere military surprise. Their mental model of how armies worked, their entire understanding of the relationship between fighting force and food supply, was being demonstrated to be wrong in real time. And they had no framework for understanding why, and therefore no strategy for exploiting it. But the Chinese campaigns were still, in retrospect, the easy version of the problem. Northern China was not a desert. It was not a salt flat or a mountain range, or a territory designed by geography to be lethal to any army foolish enough to cross it without extensive preparation. The real test, the one that would settle the question of what the Mongol food system was truly capable of, came 8 years later, in the landscape that the rest of the world had always assumed would protect the Khwarezm Empire from any conceivable northern threat. The Karakum Desert. Shah Muhammad II of Khwarezm was not a stupid man. His empire stretched across modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan, a domain of enormous wealth and sophisticated urban culture, anchored by cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench that represented the peak of medieval Islamic civilization. He had an army of several 100,000 men, trained soldiers, supported by a military infrastructure of considerable sophistication. And he had what he considered an unassailable strategic advantage: geography. His northern frontier was protected by the Sir Darya River. Beyond it lay the Kizilkum Desert to the northwest and the Karakum Desert to the west and southwest, two of the most inhospitable landscapes in Central Asia. Vast expanses of sand and salt and killing heat where no army could march with any hope of maintaining cohesion or combat effectiveness. You could not supply a large force across those deserts. You could not feed it or water it. The land itself would destroy any invader before the first spear was thrown. The Shah distributed his forces among his fortress cities along the river frontier, planning to defeat the Mongols in detail as they crossed and exhausted themselves against prepared defences. It was a sound plan. It was, by every military logic that the Shah understood, a winning plan. Genghis Khan attacked in all directions simultaneously. 3 columns, operating independently but coordinated by the Yam communication system, descended on the Khwarezm frontier from different angles at roughly the same time. 2 of the columns struck predictable routes, across the Sir Darya at established crossing points, exactly where the Shah's garrisons expected them. The 3rd column, commanded by Genghis Khan's greatest general, Jebe, and his son, Chagatai, did something that the Shah had explicitly calculated to be militarily impossible. They crossed the Kizilkum Desert. 4 days of hard riding through terrain with almost no water and almost no food. The horses dug for water at dried riverbeds with their hooves. The warriors ate their borts and drank from the blood of their horses and kept moving. When they emerged on the far side and appeared impossibly behind the Shah's main defensive positions, the psychological effect was as devastating as any cavalry charge. The Shah did not merely lose a battle. He lost his confidence in the fundamental reliability of the world. An army had appeared from a direction that armies could not come from. The impossible had become tactical reality. The cities fell in sequence: Otrar, Khojend, Bukhara, Samarkand. The city of magnificent gardens, one of the jewels of the medieval world, a city of 500,000 people, protected by walls and garrison, and the accumulated wealth of centuries, fell in 19 days. Muhammad II fled south, then west, then to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died of illness with his empire in ruins behind him. Before his death, captured court officials reported that his last coherent question, asked repeatedly in the final weeks, was the same question that every commander who faced the Mongols eventually reached. How were they eating? The Persian historian Atta Malik Juvaini, writing 20 years after the fall of Khwarezm, from sources that included survivors of the conquest and captured documents from the Mongol archives, described the logistical apparatus of the campaign with a precision that reflected his evident struggle to find categories for what he was describing. The Mongol forces moved, he wrote, like a flood, without apparent source, without apparent need for the channels and containers that water normally requires. They were everywhere at once. They could not be tracked by their supply lines, because they had no supply lines. They could not be predicted by the pace of their provisioning, because their provisioning moved with them. He was trying, in the vocabulary of a sophisticated medieval administrator, to describe something for which medieval administration had no vocabulary. A military force that had internalized its logistics so completely that the distinction between the fighting element and the supply element had ceased to exist. By the time the Mongol Tumens crossed the Carpathians into Hungary and Poland in the winter of 1241, the food system had been tested and proven across 20 years of continuous campaigning, spanning thousands of kilometers of the most varied terrain on Earth. Desert, steppe, mountain, river valley, cultivated farmland. The system had functioned in all of them, with modifications appropriate to each environment. But Europe, and specifically the particular conditions of Central European winter in 1241, would reveal the one constraint that the Mongol food system could not engineer its way around. Not hunger. Horses don't starve in winter when there's snow. They paw through it to the grass beneath, a behavior bred into the Mongolian breed over thousands of years of steppe winters. Not thirst. Mongolian horses could eat snow for hydration when necessary. Not cold. The horses were built for cold. The constraint was grass. Specifically, the availability of sufficient grazing land to sustain the enormous number of horses that a Mongol campaign force required. The European campaigns of 1241 came closer to this limit than any previous operation. The armies were large. Estimates vary, but figures of 60 to 80,000 warriors are broadly accepted, implying a horse population of between 300,000 and over 1 million animals, depending on which string size estimate you use. Central European farmland in the early 13th century was densely cultivated. There were fewer open pastures than the steppe, fewer opportunities to spread the horse population thinly enough across available grazing to prevent localized exhaustion of the grass. The Mongol commanders were experienced enough to manage this problem. They rotated their forces across wide fronts, never concentrating their horses in any single area long enough to strip the pasture bare. But the constraint was real, and it was growing more acute as the campaign extended and the horses were not getting the recovery time they needed. This is the context for the great historical mystery of 1241. Why did the Mongols stop? They had destroyed the Hungarian army at Mohi in April of 1241 with their customary surgical efficiency, feigning retreat across a bridge to draw the Hungarian cavalry into a killing ground, then striking from 3 sides simultaneously, while a subsidiary force crossed the river downstream and took the defenders in the flank. They had crushed the Polish coalition at Legnica 2 days later. The road to Vienna was open. The road to the Rhine was open. There was no military force in Western Europe capable of stopping them. And then Ergedei Khan died in December 1241, and the army withdrew. The official reason, the need for the senior commanders to return for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would select a new Great Khan, was real and constituted a genuine obligation. But historians have long debated whether the withdrawal would have happened regardless, given the grassland constraints that were beginning to limit operational freedom in ways that the commanders were clearly aware of. The Mongol food system was not infinitely scalable. The further west you pushed, the denser the cultivation, the fewer the open pastures, the more the logistical calculation shifted from abundantly sustainable toward manageable but demanding. And a system designed for the open steppe, however brilliantly engineered, was being asked to function in conditions that were, in important ways, the opposite of what it had been designed for. The steppe warriors withdrew east. They would not return to Central Europe. But the lesson they had demonstrated, the lesson that the European kingdoms, scrambling to rebuild their shattered armies and fortify their borders against an invasion they feared was merely postponed, spent the next 2 decades studying without comprehension, was that the limit of the Mongol food system was not starvation. The limit was grass, which meant the limit was geography, which meant that anywhere the steppe reached, anywhere the horse could eat, the Mongol army could go. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim was, by most historical accounts, a man who understood the symbolic dimensions of power better than its practical requirements. He was the commander of the faithful, the successor to the Prophet's political authority, the lord of the most prestigious court in the Islamic world. His city, Baghdad, the city of peace, the house of wisdom, the center of the medieval world's most sophisticated civilization, was protected by walls 30 feet high and a moat 60 feet wide. He had a garrison of 100,000 soldiers. He had warehouses full of grain. He had read the same intelligence reports about the Mongols that every other ruler in the Islamic world had read. He had heard the same stories about cities that had resisted and been annihilated, cities that had surrendered and been administered, cities that had tried to wait out the siege and found that the siege did not end, because the besieging force did not require the logistical resolution that should have forced it to lift and withdraw after weeks of failure. He had heard all of this, and he did not believe it, because it was not possible. Armies ran out of food. That was the organizing principle of siege warfare, the bedrock assumption on which every defender's strategy had been built since the first city wall was constructed. You hold out. You wait. Eventually, they run out of food and they go home. That was how it worked. Hulagu Khan's army arrived at the walls of Baghdad in January of 1258 and began its preparations with the methodical efficiency that the Mongol military apparatus had refined across 4 decades of continuous operation. The horses grazed on the plains of Mesopotamia, which were, in the winter of 1258, abundantly supplied with the dried grasses and stubble of a recently completed harvest. The warriors ate their borts, drank their ayrag, maintained their horses, and waited. The Caliph's first message to Hulagu demanded that the Mongols withdraw. Hulagu's response was polite, measured, and entirely clear. The Caliph should come out and surrender. The Caliph did not come out. The garrison made several sorties, which were repulsed with minimal Mongol casualties. The walls held. The grain warehouses were full, and by every calculation the Caliph's advisors were capable of making, the Mongol army should have been approaching the point at which continued siege became logistically impossible. 12 days after the siege began in earnest, the walls of Baghdad were breached. The city fell in a week. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed, rolled in a felt carpet, as the Mongol custom dictated for men of royal blood, and trampled by horses, so that his blood did not touch the ground. The House of Wisdom, repository of 900 years of accumulated Islamic scholarship, was burned or thrown into the Tigris, the water running dark with ink for days afterward. The thing that the Caliph had calculated could not happen, had happened. Not because his calculations were mathematically wrong, but because the foundational premise of his calculations, that an army laying siege must eventually exhaust its provisions, was simply not true of the force he was facing. Not every lesson in military history belongs to the victors. The Battle of Ain Jalut, fought on the 3rd of September 1260, at a spring in the Jezreel Valley in what is now northern Israel, was the first lesson the Mongols ever taught the world about how to beat them. Not by being stronger, not by having better weapons, but by understanding the system and knowing precisely where to attack it. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was, in 1260, the last significant military power remaining between the Mongol advance and the Western Mediterranean. Cairo was the prize, and the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars knew, with the clarity of men who had studied their enemy, with the professional attention of soldiers who understood that their lives depended on getting it right, exactly what they needed to do. They needed to separate the Mongol army from its horses' food. The Mamluks withdrew from their fortified positions and moved north into the Jordan Valley, drawing the Mongol advance guard under Kitbuka Noyan after them, into a landscape that was, in the brutal heat of early September, approaching its annual nadir of available grazing. The Jordan Valley, in high summer, was not quite desert, not the Karakum, not the Kizilkum, but it was dry, the grass brown and sparse, the water sources reduced to their minimum flow. For a force of ordinary size, it would have been manageable. for the Mongol advance guard, reduced by the requirements of maintaining control over the vast territories already conquered. Operating at the end of an extended line of communication that stretched back through Syria and Persia, it was a constraint. Kitbukar's forces crossed the Jordan and advanced south toward Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, named for the biblical giant who, according to tradition, had been killed somewhere in this valley, and walked into a trap. Not a tactical encirclement in the classic Mongol sense, not a sudden flanking strike or a feigned retreat. A geographical trap. They had advanced into terrain where their horses could not recover the strength they had expended, where the heat was maximized, where the distances from adequate grazing were precisely calibrated to the edge of what the animals could sustain. Baber's cavalry hit the Mongol vanguard hard, and then, in a display of tactical nerve that required extraordinary confidence in their mounts and their own horsemanship, feigned retreat, using the Mongols' own most reliable tactic against them. Kitbukar advanced in pursuit, as any Mongol commander trained in the use of the feigned retreat would naturally expect the pursued force to be exhausted and vulnerable. Instead, the full Mamluk force, which had been positioned in the hills flanking the valley, closed the trap. The Mongol horses were tired. They had been marching and fighting in heat that made the steppe seem temperate, on ground that provided inadequate fodder, at the end of a campaign that had been running continuously for months, without the rest periods that even the hardiest Mongolian stock required. When the Mamluk cavalry struck from the flanks and the feigned retreat reversed itself into a charge, the Mongol horses could not respond with the explosive speed and sustained pursuit capacity that had decided every previous engagement in the Mongols' favour. They were not starved, they were not broken, but they were depleted. And in the narrow mathematics of a close battle between professional forces, depleted was enough. Kitbukar Noyan was captured and executed. His force was destroyed. The Mongol advance into Africa was permanently halted. The Battle of Ain Jalut was, in retrospect, less a military victory than a scientific breakthrough. The Mamluks had run an experiment on the Mongol food system, identified its single genuine constraint, designed a battlefield scenario that maximized that constraint, and won as a result. They had not beaten the Mongols by being better fighters, or by having better weapons, or by finding some tactical formation that neutralized the famous Mongol archery. They had beaten them by cutting off the horses from their grass, by denying the walking granary its own source of fuel. It was the most elegant strategic insight of the 13th century, and it took the most sophisticated military culture in the medieval Islamic world nearly 40 years of careful observation to arrive at it. The arithmetic of Mongol conquest is a number that historians still argue about, not because the records are entirely absent, but because the numbers, when you arrive at them, are difficult to accept as real. 40 million dead. That figure, drawn from demographic analyses of population records before and after the major Mongol campaigns in China, Central Asia, and the Middle East, represents the most widely cited estimate of the total human cost of the conquests that unfolded between approximately 1206 and 1260. Some historians argue for higher figures. None argue for figures that would make the historical implications less staggering. In the context of a global population that, in the early 13th century, stood at approximately 400 million people, the Mongol conquests may have killed 1 in 10 of every human being alive on the planet. Not one of those deaths, not a single one in the entire catastrophic catalogue, occurred because the Mongol army ran short of provisions. Genghis Khan himself died in 1227. not from a blade or a siege tower, or the accumulated weight of military defeat, but from the consequences of a fall from his horse during a campaign against the Xia. He was approximately 65 years old, which was, for a man who had spent the entirety of his adult life on horseback in the most physically demanding military campaigns in recorded history, a remarkable age. He had built, from the absolute poverty of a rejected clan's youngest surviving son, an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. 12 million square miles, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. He left it to his sons. His immediate successor, Ögedei Khan, presided over the continued expansion of the empire with considerable military effectiveness. It was Ögedei who authorized the European campaigns of 1241. Ögedei, whose death recalled the army from the gates of Vienna. But his reign also marked the beginning of a transformation that would prove, in the long arc of history, fatal to everything the food system had built. Ögedei was a man who enjoyed the fruits of conquest with an enthusiasm that alarmed even his Mongol companions. He died in 1241, officially from illness, with most sources agreeing that excessive consumption of the empire's wine supply contributed substantially to his decline. The man who had inherited a military machine built on the discipline of Spartan self-sufficiency died of drinking too much of what his empire had conquered. The irony was not lost on the chroniclers who recorded it. The battlefield of Ain Jalut, 3 days after the Mamluk victory, was quiet in a way that differed fundamentally from the quiet of other great battlegrounds of history. Most medieval battles left behind a landscape of specific identifiable ruin, broken wagons, scattered grain, the detritus of a supply system disrupted and abandoned. At Ain Jalut, there was no supply system to leave ruins. There were dead horses, dead men, and the strange absence that was already becoming the Mongol army's most recognizable signature. No evidence of how they had been eating. No provision wagons. No grain sacks split open in the fighting. No commissary tents. Nothing to suggest that the force that had stood on this ground had required, in any conventional sense, the support structure that armies required. The Mamluk soldiers, moving through the aftermath, reported that the Mongol dead carried in their saddlebags small quantities of dried powder that no one in the victorious army could immediately identify. Some accounts suggest it was dismissed as a form of animal feed. No one present seems to have recognized it as borts, as the preserved protein of an entire military system compressed into a leather pouch the size of a fist. The Persian historian Ibn al-Athir, writing from Baghdad in the years after the conquest, described the Mongol army with a phrase that resonates across 8 centuries. They came from nowhere and needed nothing. It was not entirely accurate. They came from the steppe and they needed grass. But as a summary of how the Mongol food system appeared to the civilizations it destroyed, it is as precise as language can get. They came from nowhere, they needed nothing, and the world was never the same. The shadow of the Mongol food system extends across military history in ways that most historians have underappreciated. In part because the system was so thoroughly biological, so embedded in the specific animals, specific people, and specific landscape of the Mongolian steppe, that it resisted the kind of systematic analysis and replication that normally transmits military innovation across cultures and centuries. Napoleon studied the Mongols. He read the available accounts with the attention of a man who understood logistics as a primary determinant of military outcome, which he did. Better, arguably, than any European commander before him. He understood the principle: minimize the gap between the fighting element and its food supply, ideally by eliminating that gap entirely. He could not replicate the solution because his soldiers were not Mongolian, his horses were not Mongolian, and his army could not subsist on a diet of powdered horse meat and fermented mare's milk. The biological substrate for the system was not transferable. The principle was. But a principle without implementation is only admiration. The modern military ration, the MRE, meal ready to eat, which has been a feature of American military logistics since the 1980s and is now the standard field ration for dozens of armies worldwide, is in conceptual terms, sports. It is the application of the fundamental insight that Mongol women were applying to autumn slaughter in the 13th century. Remove the water from food, concentrate the calories and protein, package them in a form that requires no preparation beyond the addition of heat or water, and you have created something that a soldier can carry for extended periods without degradation and consume without interruption of operational tempo. The materials science is different. The nutritional understanding is more sophisticated. The packaging is polymer rather than dried bovine bladder. But the principle is identical. The Special Operations Forces of the modern American military, the SEALs, the Rangers, the Special Forces, operate on a logistical doctrine that would have been immediately recognizable to a Mongol two-man commander of the 13th century. Small units operating independently in hostile territory, carrying their entire sustenance on their persons, capable of extending their operational range beyond the reach of conventional supply chains, self-sustaining in the most literal sense. The doctrine is called light footprint in modern military terminology. In the 13th century, it was just how you prepared for a campaign. The civilizational reckoning of the Mongol conquests continues to shape the modern world in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. The demographic collapse of Central Asia and the Middle East following the campaigns of the 1220s and 1250s took generations to reverse. Some regions never fully recovered. The destruction of the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, systems that had sustained agriculture in one of the world's oldest agricultural regions since the Sumerians, contributed to a desertification process whose effects are still visible in the landscape of modern Iraq. The Black Death, which began in Central Asia in the 1340s and spread along the Mongol trade routes to devastate Europe, was a consequence. Direct or indirect, historians debate the exact mechanism, of the disruption of ecological and demographic patterns that the Mongol conquests had produced. But the most profound legacy of the Mongol food system is not demographic or ecological. It is philosophical. The great empires of history, Rome, Persia, China, Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, were all, in the deepest sense, about accumulation. They built granaries, and the granaries were their power. They built roads to supply those granaries, and the roads were their reach. They built walls to protect the granaries, and the walls were their security. The entire civilization was, in the end, a system for producing, storing, and defending surplus food. And the army was the instrument by which that surplus was both produced and protected. The Mongol system was the inversion of this. It accumulated nothing, it stored nothing, it depended on nothing that could be taken away. A civilization that cannot be cut off from its supply cannot be starved into submission. A civilization that carries its resources on its back cannot be besieged. A civilization whose power is kinetic rather than static, moving rather than stored, living rather than preserved, is, in a profound sense, indestructible by the methods that had destroyed every previous civilization. The paradox, of course, is that the system destroyed itself the moment it succeeded. The warrior who could survive on horseback in the Karakum desert with nothing but a pouch of dried meat and a bag of fermented mare's milk was an instrument of incredible power, so long as he remained that warrior. The moment he sat down in a palace in Samarkand and ordered the court cooks to prepare him a proper meal from the empire's abundant provisions, he ceased to be that warrior. He became, instead, exactly the kind of person that warrior had conquered. The successors of Genghis Khan, sitting in their palaces in Beijing, Tabriz, Samarkand, and Karakorum, eating the food of the civilizations they had destroyed, drinking wine from conquered vineyards, growing fat on the surplus they had sworn to disdain, lost not their military skill first, nor their political organization first, nor their territorial control first. They lost their hunger first. And when they lost their hunger, they lost everything else in due course. The man who needs nothing cannot be controlled. The man who has everything is already a prisoner of what he has. Today, on the open steppe of Mongolia, the descendants of those warriors still practice something of the old ways, though the empire is long gone, and the world it shaped has shaped itself in turn around different structures of power. Children in the countryside learn to ride before they learn to read. Mares are still milked at dawn, and ayrag still ferments in leather bags, and kurut is still dried on the rooftops of felt and wood homes that look, if you squint against the morning light, not entirely unlike the yurts from which the greatest military machine in history was launched. They do not know, those children, that they are the custodians of a secret that once remade the world. They are simply doing what their people have always done: moving, tending, surviving, carrying their sustenance with them into a landscape that would kill anyone who needed more than they had. The great granaries of the civilizations that the Mongols destroyed have mostly vanished, burned, looted, collapsed into the earth. The fields that fed the armies that could not stop them are dust, or parking lots, or apartment blocks. But somewhere on the steppe, a horse is walking through the snow, pawing through the frozen ground with hooves bred for exactly this purpose, finding the grass beneath. And the grass is still there.